Welcome to the Ketopower Podcast. I'm Claude, your coach, here to help. Before we get started, just a reminder, all of December, we have our holiday sale on. It's a bring a friend for free. So you can book anything in December and bring a friend, share the costs. Even if you're not having your appointments in December, you want to save that for after the holidays, that's fine too, so long as you book the appointment in December. Okay, so you have till the end of the month, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Now, I'm going to continue my series on the COVID-19, what you can do right now, whether or not you're going to decide to take the vaccine that just came out or not. Still, you should look at what we're going to go through today. Last time, if you haven't seen it, um, check out our YouTube, and our latest podcast was on the effects of hyperglycemia on COVID-19 outcomes. Okay, so I'm just going to do a screen share here for this next one. And if you're listening to this on audio only, you might want to check out our podcast on YouTube to get the full visuals, but I'll read through most of this. I've highlighted quite a few areas here that I think you'll find useful. All right. So this one's from the Journal of Translational Medicine. It was published on November 20th, 2020, and it's colorfully entitled The Dark Side of the Spoon: Glucose, Ketones, and COVID-19, a possible role for the ketogenic diet. So we'll go to the introduction, skip over the first paragraph. I think we kind of aware of what's up there. And like I said, you can read this, and I'll have the link down in the notes. Okay. In consideration of a relatively low effectiveness of influenza vaccination, public health practices have been implemented by health authorities in order to limit the spread of respiratory viruses. So this is kind of in general, okay? They're considering that the influenza vaccine has a low effectiveness. We have yet to see, I mean, they're claiming a 95% effectiveness with the COVID-19 vaccine. We'll see how that number changes, if it does, once that vaccine goes into the general population. We know some of those vaccines have to be kept at minus 70 or minus 80 degrees Celsius. It's one thing to test in perfect conditions in a laboratory. Once, we have to take those vaccines out in trucks, and maybe they stay overnight in a warehouse or whatnot, those numbers might change. And we'll stay tuned for that. Okay. Here we go. Common suggested health practices are related to people's behaviors as hand washing, use of face masks, eye protection, social distancing, and were encouraged during the pandemic spread of coronavirus 2019 disease caused by a virus, SARS-CoV-2. For which there is not yet a vaccine. So that's changed recently. The vaccines, there's a couple of them out already, nor effective pharmacological treatment so far. So, risk factors for COVID-19, role of lifestyle behaviors. Despite the current mortality rate of 2.3%, the emergence of large numbers of infected patients within a short period of time determined the relevant difficulties in healthcare systems of several countries, with an enormous loss of life. Among risk factors for SARS-CoV-2, numerous studies identified a specific association of COVID-19 fatality with advanced chronological age and presence of comorbidities, particularly diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and chronic kidney disease. Some of these diseases are related to lifestyle behavior. Thus, it should be mandatory to act on the aforementioned risk factors to improve patient outcomes and to reduce health impacts of possible future new outbreaks. It is worth to mention that also the increase in sedentarism happened during the recent lockdown measures led to a negative impact on general health conditions. Okay. The sedentarism due to the shelter in place policy enforced in several countries during COVID-19 pandemic displayed the deleterious effects on skeletal muscle metabolism, inducing insulin resistance, fat deposition, and low grade systemic inflammation, with an overall worsening of metabolic parameters, glucose control, and inflammatory status, not to mention mental health and higher stress levels, which will usually increase all of the aforementioned. In this regard, sarcopenic obesity, characterized by the coexistence of excessive adiposity and low muscle mass, is strongly associated with an increase in cardiovascular risk, insulin resistance, and low grade inflammation. Therefore, it represents, together with inadequacy of nutritional status, a condition associated with increased susceptibility to viral infection. Importantly, critically ill COVID-19 patients with obesity and malnutrition showed worse outcomes than obese patients without malnutrition. Okay, yes, it is possible to be obese and malnourished. Okay, if you're eating lots of junk food, high fructose corn syrup laced um, processed foods, you very well may not have the nutrition you need, but you will get that stimulating effect to the insulin, that storing effect on your body. If you're consuming a lot of these seed oils, which they colorfully call vegetable oils, it's not vegetables, it's seeds. These are typically very toxic. They're detoxified through mechanical processes and chemical processes in order to make them consumable by humans. But they are not good oils for you, generally speaking. Okay, so you combine all that, and you can have very severe malnutrition and yet be obese. And it really comes out when your body's faced with combating diseases such as COVID-19. So let's go down here and talk about obesity and hyperglycemia. Our last study that we looked at looked specifically at hyperglycemia independent of diabetes. Here it reads, obesity represents one of the recognized prognostic factors for requirement of intensive care and high risk of death during SARS-CoV-2 infection. In keeping with this, an important shift of severe COVID-19 disease to younger age has been clearly documented with obesity. Okay, so obesity independent of age. Obesity affects several critical functions characterized as an increased vulnerability towards COVID-19 adverse outcomes. Obesity state restricts ventilation by disrupting diaphragm exertions, alters immune responses to viral infection, determines a chronic low-grade inflammation, and worsens glucose tolerance and oxidative stress with adverse effects on cardiovascular function. Importantly, obese patients experience a more severe COVID-19 syndrome since obesity is characterized by an altered hemostatic balance with increased coagulation and defective fibrinolysis. Okay, and that's the coagulation of the blood, tendency to clot, and which results in pro-thrombotic state, which means a tendency for those clots to form thrombosis, which means clog and block off the um, blood flow to certain parts of organs. Furthermore, the coexistence of obesity and metabolic associated fatty liver disease, here they have it acronymed as MAFLD, but I do believe that's a typo. Should read NAFLD for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, determines a six-fold increased risk of severe outcome of COVID-19 independently of age, sex, smoking, diabetes, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. Notably, a recent report showed that adipose tissue expresses very high levels of transcript for ACE2. Now, remember when this started coming out, one of the first things we learned is that the virus attacks the ACE2 receptors. Okay, so they're showing a relationship between high adipose tissue and high levels of transcript of the ACE2. An enzyme attached to the outer surface of pneumocytes, which is used by coronavirus to enter and infect cells, raising the question whether adipose tissue may represent a reservoir of SARS-CoV-2 and a strategic site to amplify the cytokines cascade triggered by viral infection. That's another thing that came out. We had a lot of cases that were noted of people who got infected, started to show symptoms, got somewhat sick, started to recover, and then would deteriorate very rapidly with this cytokine storm. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. And there's a very high correlation between that high um, propensity for the cytokine storm that destroys critical tissue in your lungs and other organs, and a high adipose tissue, which is basically lots of fat. Diabetes is associated with an increased risk of severe viral respiratory tract infection, including H1N1 influenza, given that elevated glucose level can also suppress antiviral response. Okay, so diabetes in general, not good for fighting off viruses, especially respiratory viruses. In China, a study on more than 500 subjects hospitalized with SARS-CoV-2 revealed that high fasting glucose levels determined increased rate of death. Okay, and you get high fasting glucose levels with type 2 diabetes. We'll skip a couple paragraphs here. For all these reasons, hyperglycemia, high glycemic variability should be adequately prevented in order to improve the outcomes of COVID-19 patients. It is hence clear that well-controlled blood glucose levels will correlate with lower risk of infection and or better disease resolution. In consideration of potentially adverse effects of commonly used drugs for type 2 diabetes and its comorbidities, a nutritional approach lowering blood glucose concentration should be considered as a first option. Okay, so nutrition first in order to prevent or reduce SARS-CoV-2 infection risk and related complications. Inflammation, our mutual friend, which may become harmful. Okay. It is well established that the aberrant release of pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines induced by SARS-CoV-2 infection is central to the fatal outcomes of COVID-19 syndrome. It is exhaustively documented that hyperglycemia may worsen the inflammatory response. Lower down. It is hence likely that dysregulated immune cell population and activity observed in diabetic patients represents important risk factors and determine worsening of the inflammatory response during SARS-CoV-2 infection. Chronic low-grade inflammation should be carefully considered in order to understand the risk of obesity and associated disease, since several key inflammatory markers are strictly linked with an increased risk of adverse outcomes in obesity associated comorbidities such as cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. There is a large body of evidence indicating a positive correlation between C reactive protein, okay, and that comes out when you get tested there for inflammation or response to infection. C reactive protein is a classic marker that they check, known as a marker of systemic inflammation and body composition. Ketogenic diet as a lifestyle behavior approach against COVID 19, which is our next title here. Among lifestyle behaviors, it is surprising that nutritional advice are still poorly considered in public health discussions about the prevention and reduction of SARS-CoV-2 infection risk and related complications. Thus, a call to action is needed in order to promote proper nutrition strategies to improve the immune response and the potential clinical outcomes towards COVID 19. Well, that's what we're doing right here. We're trying to sensitize people to a nutritional approach. Second, ketogenic diets. So, a little bit about ketogenic diets here. If you follow this channel, you probably already know a whole lot about ketogenic diets, but we'll go through this real quick here. Ketogenic diets are high fat, low carbohydrate diets and have been primarily used to treat epilepsy in children since the 1920s. Interestingly, their use has been adapted to face different pathological conditions, severe obesity, metabolic disease, migraines, cancer, etc. By changing macronutrient composition and energy content. In this context, the importance of ketogenic diets in the treatment of obesity and its associated comorbidities, type 2 diabetes, dyslipidemia, insulin resistance, inflammation, has recently emerged. In particular, very low calorie ketogenic diets, VLCKDs, characterized by a marked restriction of carbohydrate intake, usually lower than 30 grams a day, with a relative increase in the proportion of fat and protein, and a total daily energy intake of less than 800 kilocalories, represents a highly effective nutritional strategy in patients who need a rapid weight loss over a short-term period, such as individuals with moderate to severe obesity, associated cardiovascular risk factors, leading to a marked improvement in insulin resistance, glucose, and blood pressure control. Weight loss obtained with CKDs, okay, very low calorie ketogenic diets, is mostly secondary to fat mass content and hepatic insulin resistance only after 6 days of treatment. Okay, so um, some of you were somewhere past mid-December here, 14th. Actually, we're just 14th of December, almost past mid-December. It may be several months still till you have access to a vaccine, and who knows what other disease, virus you need to face. This treatment that they're proposing, you're seeing results after 6 days of treatment. Okay, that's less than a week. So consider that. You can get in a better state within a week. And then if you persist, you just get more benefit. Okay. Obviously, if you've got severe weight to lose, adipose tissue to lose, you're not going to lose all of that in a week. But you can already reverse your insulin resistance and many of the comorbidity factors within a week. Okay. There is a large body of evidence demonstrating the efficacy of very low calorie ketogenic diets in blood glucose level. As a matter of fact, the very low intake of carbohydrates in this nutritional protocol dampens large spike in blood sugar, thereby improving glycemic variability. In obese patient with type 2 diabetes, short-term exposure to very low calorie ketogenic diets determines a marked improvement in beta cell function at a higher extent than what could be explained by the weight loss obtained. The drastic reduction in carbohydrate intake is associated with significant suppression of hepatic glucose production due to a marked improvement in hepatic insulin sensitivity. An enhanced insulin response has also been described after a short exposure to very low calorie ketogenic diets regimen with a recovery of insulin response to a hyperglycemic challenge. So this, when they test your blood sugar, you drink this really sugary drink, and then they test to see how much time it takes for your blood glucose to come back down to normal levels. Okay, for all these reasons, very low calorie ketogenic diets could be a part of a multidisciplinary strategy for metabolic rehabilitation in patients with diabetes. And we know how much of a factor that is in COVID-19 outcomes. Okay. Potential preventive effects of ketogenic diets on SARS-CoV-2 infection. Ketogenic diet may play a role modulating both innate and adaptive immune cells with synergetically protect, which synergetically protects the host against pathogen assaults. Okay, and we're going to go a bit more in depth in the innate immune cells. Uh, After that, they talk mostly about like a mouse study for the adaptive immune cells. We know there's some effects there, but there's a bit more substance in the first part of that section here. Okay, so if you're with us on the YouTube, you see this little diagram here with this fellow who's taking in the ketogenic diet, and he gets exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 viruses, and that triggers the NLRP3 inflammasome response. And with his ketogenic diet, basically you see that that response of the severe inflammatory response that leads the cytokine storms is being blocked by the beta hydroxybutyrate, basically his ketones. Okay. Reading right along here, the description that they give. The NLRP3 inflammasome activation due to a viral infection has been documented for influenza A virus, encephalomyocarditis virus, hepatitis C virus, and SARS-CoV. That's the original SARS coronavirus. That's the one that was out, I believe, in 2003. And it seems to be mediated also by a viral protein known as viroporins, specific molecules which assemble into homo-oligomers and form hydrophilic pores across the cytosolic organelle membranes, thereby increasing sodium, potassium, and calcium flux, increase intracellular calcium concentration, and reduce intracellular potassium levels represent important triggering signals for NLRP3 inflammasome activation and subsequent massive secretion of pro-inflammatory cytokines. All coronavirus known so far, including the new spread of SARS-CoV-2, are able to encode for viroporins E and 3A, and their expression is functional to the activation of NLRP3 inflammasome in COVID-19 disease. There is growing evidence that beta hydroxybutyrate, these are your ketones here that you produce when you're on a ketogenic diet. So beta hydroxybutyrate inhibits NLRP3 inflammasome activation. Okay, so it goes counter, the virus comes in, triggers the NLRP3 inflammasome, but you've got the presence of beta hydroxybutyrate, and that prevents or inhibits that action. Okay. The favorable effects of the ketogenic diet on inflammatory cytokines in humans, in animals, and cellular models are well established. Beta hydroxybutyrate is able to act on a central common signaling pathway specific to NLRP3 inflammasome in response to many different pro inflammatory stimuli. More specifically, beta hydroxybutyrate inhibits NLRP3 inflammasome activation through the reduction of potassium efflux from macrophages and the inhibition of inflammasome assembly. Consistent with these observations, beta hydroxybutyrate uh, dependent inhibition of IL-1 beta and IL-18 secretion in human monocytes has been documented. Those are immune response, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 18. In consideration of the role of inflammasome activation in triggering the systemic inflammatory cascade observed in COVID-19 patients, approaches based on increasing plasma beta hydroxybutyrate, such as with the ketogenic diet, should be taken into account to prevent the development and or progress of the cytokine storm syndrome. Okay, so apparently being ketogenic has protective can protect you, has some protective effects on the cytokine storm, which is basically the worst part or the worst outcome for the COVID-19. We'll skip right down to the conclusions here. The next part, like I said, is adaptive cell mediation immunity. This part is less clear. I'll have the link in there if you want to read through it. I found it to be somewhat less pertinent, even though it's very supportive. Conclusions. Okay, I'll skip down the second paragraph. We believe that a ketogenic induced increase in endogenous ketone bodies could represent a more valuable strategy to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection and adverse outcomes in obese patients, particularly in the current context of a prolonged pandemic emergency. Indeed, prevention and or correction of all risk conditions associated with serious COVID-19 disease, obesity, hyperglycemia, high glycemic variability, insulin resistance, and hypertension is mandatory in consideration of new waves of infection in the absence of effective pharmacological therapies and vaccination. This could could be obtained with a nutritional strategy aimed to induce fat mass loss, to reduce chronic inflammation, hepatic and systemic insulin resistance, and to improve nutritional status, cardiovascular health, immune response, glucose homeostasis, and blood pressure control. Finally, the adoption of a well-structured and personalized ketogenic diet regimen could help a progressive nutritional education and rehabilitation in obese patients, providing an effective tool to modify lifestyle behavior, supporting a long-term control of body weight, and favoring a reduction in all associated risk factors for potentially severe complications related to SARS-CoV-2 infection. Well-designed multi-centric studies on the actual incidence of severe COVID-19 disease among obese patients who followed or not a structured protocol of ketogenic diet could be helpful to confirm such hypothesis. During this difficult pandemic era, the adoption of lifestyle preventative measures is mandatory and should be carefully implemented. And on the original paper there, where the link, you'll have all the citations for this article. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed. Let me stop share here. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you enjoyed these videos, if you're getting substance from it, Make sure you subscribe and you click that bell so you don't miss any of my further videos. I'll have a few of more of these, and hopefully I'm hoping to get a few interviews in within a couple of weeks here, hopefully. So I'll keep you posted on that. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.